Welcome back to the Jewish Diaspora Report. This is Mike Jordan. On this episode, we're going to talk about invisible minorities, accidental racism, and Khloe Kardashian. Let's get started. Today's episode will start with the issue of invisible minorities. Many people may not have heard this term before. The idea of an invisible minority is being a minority within a larger culture, but unfortunately not showing visibly as part of the minority. Oftentimes, for many reasons, anti-Semitism as a form of racism is overlooked or downplayed within the majority culture. There are likely many causes for this downplaying or ignoring of issues facing the Jewish communities around the world. One theory that I was recently reading is called the model minority myth. And the idea of this is, especially when it comes to Jewish people, this is an age-old idea that Jewish people are very smart and successful and crafty. And the idea being that because we are such a successful people, that we're put on an imaginary pedestal. The idea being that Jewish people are very successful, very well off. They protect themselves. They take care of each other. They do a lot of charity work. They don't really need anyone from the outside's help. The catch-22 here, of course, being that once we're put on a pedestal and said to be very successful and not needing any help, that same pedestal ends up being the pedestal we're on when we are being torn down and attacked and criticized for our own successes. Every Jewish community has a wide variety of people who are well off or not so well off. It is really much of an oversimplification. Ashkenazi Jews or Jews of a European background tend to be seen as, quote, conditionally white or conditionally European, so they can fit in with the majority. They shouldn't feel any kind of discrimination. They have the white privilege, as many people like to call it. But unfortunately, the Ashkenazi Jews, even though they are European background, aren't really able to pass this, quote, other test. They are just not white enough to have the white privilege that many people thrust upon them due to their European background. This is another reason why anti-Semitism is often overlooked or pushed aside, is because it's not really racism as long as the person is part of the majority. They look white. How could it be racist if someone is part of the majority? However, of course, it's often ignored. The historic and the tragic history of the Jewish people across Europe and across the world when it comes to bigotry, discrimination, and violence. One last theory put forward by the model minority myth is that the rise of anti-Semitism is not being taken seriously due to the fact that there's this perceived power by the Jewish people over the media and government and officials. And this pedestal that they put us on allows them to not really feel guilty about not dealing with the issues, because there's this power that we have over the government to take care of ourselves and fix our own problems. This shouldn't really surprise us, unfortunately, when we look at the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, who tracks anti-Semitism across the world. When they recently did a survey with 4.1 million people across the globe, 1.09 million, which is about 26%, harbored what they believe to be anti-Semitic attitudes towards Jewish people. They found about 19% of people within North America hold these anti-Semitic views, 24% of Western Europe, 34% of Eastern Europe, and 74% of Middle East and North Africa hold these anti-Semitic views. Obviously, there is some variety of beliefs and levels of beliefs within this, but when you look at some of these questions that the people are asked are, do Jews have too much power in the business world? 34% globally believe that Jews have too much power in the business world, or that 31% of people around the world believe that Jews have too much power in the international financial markets. And 24% of people believe that Jews have too much power over global affairs. One thing that would be scary if it wasn't so comical and ridiculous is that these people who were interviewed for this survey were asked the questions of how often do they interact with Jewish people. And only 4% said very often, 5% said somewhat often. So let's say 9% of people actually came in contact with Jewish people. So of those 9% who actually interact with Jewish people, there are 74% who have never met a Jewish person, and 3% who said once or twice they've met a Jewish person. Yet these people hold such strong views, mostly negative, of Jewish people, despite never actually meeting one and having minimal contact with one. Most of their information, they claim, comes from television. The stereotypes that they see and the television shows they watch. 52% of respondents said that their view of Jewish people comes from television. 10% says the newspaper, 13% says the internet, which I'm sure will grow as time goes on. And we all, of course, know the type of stuff that is on the internet. Unfortunately, not very fact-checked. Depending what hole you stumble down, you could enter a lot of information that may not necessarily be accurate. What this really shows us is the challenge that we face as Jewish people of having these stereotypes and these beliefs thrust upon us by people who may not have even met a Jewish person. Many of these beliefs function in the background, maybe underneath the surface, and it's a good example of the minority myth in action. On the one hand, you find that people will say that the Jewish people can take care of themselves and control all of these things and are not in need of any help from others, while that in itself is a form of anti-Semitism. After the break, we're going to continue talking about the issue of accidental racism and the unconscious or subconscious ways that anti-Semitism shows up in society today. Hang around. We'll be back in a second. In our last segment, we discussed a little bit about the invisible minority myth and the idea that Jews have perceived power, they don't need help from other people, and the unconscious or subconscious biases that some people have against Jewish people or in Jewish stereotypes. This kind of leads us to our next issue of accidental racism, or ways that people don't intend on saying something that is anti-Semitic, but oftentimes it comes out as that. The putting of Jewish people on a pedestal and suggesting that maybe the issue of anti-Semitism really doesn't affect modern-day Jewish people all that much does allow this issue that's been rising of using Jewish tragedy as some type of political gain. Nothing has made this more obvious than the worldwide pandemic, but especially the reaction that some people had to things like vaccine mandates and vaccinations and lockdowns. We have never seen before such an outcry against these things using Jewish and anti-Semitic imagery. The most notable, of course, is the putting on of a Jewish star, or the use of the Jewish star that was made infamous through Nazi propaganda and Nazi persecution of Jews, having to wear a star to identify yourself as a Jewish person. These being used as forms of political protest and speaking out against vaccines and vaccine mandates. It wouldn't be such a big deal, of course, if they didn't use a Jewish star and just had some type of other symbol to suggest they were anti-vaccination. That's their choice. It's freedom of speech. The issue, of course, is when it crosses into purposeful use of a Jewish symbol, one of terror and horror and death and murder, without even a second thought. You see these people wearing them and they are quite content and quite happy to make the similarity between Nazi Germany and vaccine mandates without even questioning where that might come from. We see normal people, everyday average people in America and in Europe, wearing these stars without questioning the symbolism and the hurt that it may cause people. For the most part, these are very intelligent people who probably would know better if it wasn't such an invisible issue that people assume that it's no big deal to wear this star. The Jewish tragedy is sort of free for everyone to use across the world as some type of political symbol, rather than the actual event that it was and the tragedy and pain that it still causes Jewish communities today. We see people all the way up to figures within the U.S. government wearing these stars and speaking out. And the most difficult part, of course, is when the Jewish community tries to speak out and suggests that this would be a wrong comparison and please do not downplay our tragedies of the past. These people will double and triple down and suggest this is a formal protest. I am totally allowed to use these symbols. to protest something that has really nothing to do with the history of the Holocaust. I am really left wondering if this would fly for any other historical event. We don't find people comparing tragedies and issues from Stalin's Russia or any of these other issues. But for some reason, the Jewish issues are a free-for-all for anyone to use as fodder for politics. I really do believe that this is because, for some reason, as Jewish people, our tragedies are seen as the past, as invisible, as in the Jews have enough power these days. They're not under any kind of oppression or challenges due to racism. So we can sort of take these issues of the past and use them because it's sort of something out of a book. It's not really something that they face on a regular basis today. Obviously, this is only one example of the use of Jewish imagery and anti-Semitic imagery for the use of politics, but it is very telling, the fact that the world doesn't really speak up for the Jewish people. And when the Jewish people try and speak up and suggest that this is a little bit of a crossing of a line when it comes to using our tragedies for political gain or for getting your message out, that it is inappropriate, we find that no one will really stand with us. It's us on our own, trying desperately to educate the world and prove that we are here and we should be visible, and our tragedies should not be made fun of or made light of or even used in inappropriate ways. It really is hard to tell the motivations of someone who does this. I would like to think, and I would suggest, that most people are just sort of ignorant and blind to the history of some of these symbols, because the Jewish tragedy tends to be somewhat invisible to people who aren't Jewish, that it is just easy for them to grasp onto these symbols as something they've seen or heard of and not put it in context or understand how that might feel to other people around them. This is why I'd like to consider it as quote-unquote accidental racism, because I really don't think that many people really understand what these symbols mean and how they affect other people, but are more thinking a little bit selfishly about the message that they want to show and for the idea that they want to put forward. I love that the Jewish community tends to come out and try and educate as many people as they can. Certain people from the government will get a trip to the Holocaust Museum to understand the background and significance of that symbol or those symbols and those metaphors that they use. And sometimes it works, and sometimes they come back and continue their rhetoric for the attention that they get. But it is incumbent on us to try our very best to make sure that these symbols and these histories that are ours are not hijacked for political reasons, and we try and make ourselves, our issues, and our concerns visible to people once again, so these things can stop happening. When we come back, we're going to talk about Khloe Kardashian and her unfortunate post on social media. This is the Jewish Diaspora Report. We'll be back in a second. We just finished discussing the issue of people who accidentally say something that may be considered racist or anti-Semitic, and they're kind of not aware of it. So this leads us to the issue of Khloe Kardashian. Recently, she had made a post on social media that has kind of caught a little bit of attention from the Jewish community, especially. She was, for the holidays, deciding that she would post something about giving back to her community, and, she meant well with this, and she posted this quote: "Whenever you give to the poor, don't blow your trumpet as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may get praise from people. I assure you, that's the only reward they'll get." Matthew 6:2. This, of course, for most people who may be aware of the New Testament and the Christian canon, they would realize that Matthew, of course, is a biblical gospel for the Christian community. And obviously, this is a quote from the Christian Bible. And the first thing that sticks out to most people and starts to possibly concern people is the mention of hypocrites in synagogues. This definitely can seem on its face like anti-Semitic beliefs. Now, Khloe Kardashian definitely should have known better when she posted this. She probably should have read this over, realized that maybe it doesn't seem right to be posting something like this, mentioning specifically the synagogues. But this kind of ties into our first topic, which is A lot of people don't realize the issues here when it comes to anti-Semitism, and they're kind of blinded by these issues. Part of me wonders what goes through someone's head when they read this quote and thinking, do I engage with this kind of talk about hypocrites in the synagogues? Maybe does she not have Jewish friends or people around her that she could ask? Does this seem a little bit inappropriate to be posting? Maybe there's a better quote I could find. It actually is a little disappointing, but I don't think that she did it on purpose. I think she meant well, but unfortunately came out kind of bad. To better understand some of these anti-Semitic ideas and some of these issues that people post thinking that it's great, it's the Christian New Testament, they ignore the context that it comes with. It seems to be sort of the way that people work these days is they don't bother to look any further. They find a nice quote, they hear a nice saying, and they just go into it and repeat it. So I figured I would give a little bit of a background. I do have obviously a background in religious studies, including New Testament studies, and we would go into a little bit of understanding of maybe why this feels so anti-Semitic to us and why this isn't something great to post on social media for the context around it, aside from how it looks on its face. To better understand the Gospel of Matthew, we kind of had to get a little bit into the history of this book. Of course, the Gospel of Matthew is one of the Gospels provided in the New Testament. It is attributed to a person named Matthew that is supposedly someone close to Jesus who was telling stories from the time of Jesus. Unfortunately, most scholars do believe that this was not necessarily a person named Matthew. It was more likely a community that had some beliefs, the early Christian beliefs, that was later given the name Matthew. The group of people who authored the book of Matthew are described by Dr. Barry Wilson from York University in Toronto, Ontario, as a people that were disaffected and dissonant and thrown out of the main sanctuary, that being the temple in Jerusalem. They were on their own and undoubtedly embittered by rejection. He and his followers, that being the author, continued to think of themselves as Jews, but their allegiance had shifted to Jesus as their rabbi and promised Messiah. Essentially, what this is sort of suggesting is that this early group of followers of Jesus, known as the group of Matthew or the book of Matthew, were Jewish people who were being shunned in the Jewish community for following Jesus' teaching and believing that Jesus was a Messiah-like figure. And for being kicked out of the community or shunned in the community, in their gospel, they made sure to punish and speak terribly about the Jewish community and even go so far as to blame them for Jesus' death. It is actually in the book of Matthew that the most anti-Semitic line in history has come from. In the book of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 24, we see that Jesus is brought to trial before the governor of Judea for supposedly the crimes of teaching his way and going against the Romans. And the author of the book of Matthew says that the governor says, quote, "I am innocent of this man's blood. You bear the responsibility," to which the Jewish people at the time in verse 25 say, quote, "All of the people answered, 'His blood is on our hands and our children.'" This is often the foundation of one of the oldest versions of anti-Semitism, which is believing that the Jews have taken on the responsibility of killing Jesus, which we all know is historically unlikely and inaccurate. But Matthew, because he is such a unhappy, angry follower of Jesus, he really does not care for the Jews. His entire gospel up until this point has been negative, anti-Semitic, taking down Jewish people at the time. Now that we understand the context behind the book of Matthew, we can better understand this quote and why Matthew is calling out the hypocrites in the synagogue, because of course he himself was kicked out of that synagogue very likely and very angry with the Jewish community and was trying to call them out. Do I expect Khloe Kardashian to have understood this or understood the background or even been a biblical scholar? Definitely not. However, it goes to show that as Jewish people, we are unfortunately a little bit invisible when it comes to being a minority, because normal circumstances, you would imagine when someone sees a quote online, even from the Bible, and sees the word synagogue and hypocrites, that maybe they would stop, pause, and think about it, find some context, maybe even ask around to other Jewish friends or people in your community to understand this quote and maybe think about how it might affect other people. So in the end, I don't think she was necessarily trying to do anything wrong. I don't think she was intentionally being hurtful or anti-Semitic. I do think that she was being a little bit silly and not doing a little bit of background, or her alarm bells didn't go off. And I guess this kind of ties in to the entire segment before this, which is, unfortunately, we are invisible. People don't see the word synagogue and hypocrites, and their alarm bells don't always go off to think, maybe I need to get some understanding of how this might affect Jewish people who are in synagogues, who are often criticized or trivialized for the beliefs that they have or the religion that they practice. One thing that I guess is up for debate, I believe at the time of posting this podcast that Khloe Kardashian has not commented. She did remove the post almost immediately after being called out by a few Jewish groups or Jewish people for the not so nice anti-Semitic accidental post. But does this deserve a comment, an apology through her social media for maybe not being as informed? Or is this just an accident, just a genuine mistake? In the end, I think that this sort of goes along with all of the other segments. I hope that this all ties in with the idea of the Jewish people being a minority, but oftentimes are invisible. Our concerns are put aside. Our concerns are downplayed. People don't really see how things can come off as anti-Semitic or hurtful to the Jewish community. We are often sort of assumed to be fine on our own. And people, I think, need to be a little bit more careful in understanding that Jewish people do have a lot of trauma from the past. And even to this day, we do face a lot of concerns that maybe people need to take a little bit more seriously, understand, and think a little bit before they post online or before they might say or assume things about Jewish people that oftentimes is based on anti-Semitic old beliefs. Let me finish this episode by thanking everybody for listening, and I really am thrilled with the outpouring of support that I've seen, the people who have followed us so far. Thank you so much for your support, and if you have any ideas for the show, please reach out to us at jdr.podcast and send us your ideas. Don't forget to like and subscribe.